Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be a part of this important meeting today. First of all, I'd like to thank organizers for inviting me to this meeting. For the next 20 minutes, I'll briefly summarize the global and regional surveillance of emerging infectious diseases, including influenza pandemic. As Dr. Lee introduced, my specialty is the surveillance of antimicrobial resistance in bacterial pathogens, but I will focus on the surveillance of influenza today. As you know, the infectious diseases still remain the second most common cause of death worldwide, and the clinical burden of infectious diseases is further amplified by various types of emerging infectious diseases. Emerging infectious diseases can be defined as infections that have newly appeared or infections whose incidence has been rapidly increasing in recent years, usually for the past 20 years. The emerging infectious diseases can be classified into three major categories. The newly emerging infections include HIV/AIDS, H1N1 influenza in 2009, Helicobacter pylori, SARS, or the antibiotic-resistant pathogens that have not been reported in the past. Re-emerging or resurging infections include TB, malaria, dengue fever, and plague. And finally, bioterrorism is another type of the emerging infectious diseases. The most representative example is anthrax, which was actually used as a biological weapon in 2001 in the United States. Emerging infectious diseases can occur anytime in anywhere in the world. This map shows the recent emerging infectious diseases for the past 30 years. And in the 21st century, we had global outbreaks of SARS and avian flu in 2003, pandemic H1N1 influenza in 2009, NDM1 producing multidrug resistant E. coli in 2010, and this year, we had a huge outbreak of enterohemorrhagic E. coli in European countries, mainly in Germany. So as shown in this map, emerging infectious diseases have occurred in all continents, both in developed and also in developing countries. Pandemic disease is a very special form of infectious disease, which is a huge disaster to human survival. As noted by Dr. Joshua Lederberg, the microbe that failed one child in a distant continent yesterday can lead yours today and see the global pandemic tomorrow. In the human history, we have a multiple pandemic episode of influenza since 1918. As presented by Dr. Monto and Dr. Webster, the Spanish flu in 1918 was the biggest one, followed by Asian flu in 1957, and the Hong Kong flu in 1968, and finally, we had a recent pandemic of H1N1 influenza in 2009. The Spanish flu in 1918 has killed almost 50 million people worldwide. So the Spanish flu is called mother of all pandemics. And after a long silence since the last pandemic of influenza in 1968, the pandemic influenza has visited again in 2009, as you can clearly remember. This was an article in Korean newspaper that was entitled "The Fear, Mask, and Just Prayer" at the very early stage of H1N1 influenza pandemic in 2009. The pandemic H1N1 influenza was the first pandemic in the 21st century that was reported from 214 countries. Although we don't know the exact number of cases, we had a total of more than 18,000 deaths from H1N1 influenza pandemic. But actually, the next pandemic that had been anticipated by many countries and WHO was avian flu by H5N1 subtype. The avian flu H5N1 was first reported in 1997 in Hong Kong and it recurred in 2003 and 2004. And since 2004, the number of cases of avian H5N1 has been slowly increasing in many countries, And as of March 2011, we have a total 562 cases with 330 deaths in 15 countries, especially in Vietnam, Indonesia, and Egypt. So more than half of the patients died of H5N1 influenza. This is very fatal infection. So as Dr. Webster indicated, if this virus is further mutated in the future to acquire the transmissibility, then it will be a huge disaster. So we are now faced with the constant threat of the various types of emerging infectious diseases and influenza pandemic. So when you try to control and prevent these emerging infectious diseases, surveillance is the most basic and important strategy. For influenza pandemic, we have 3 mechanisms for global surveillance of the influenza, which are organized by WHO. The International Health Regulations, or IHR, in 2005 is a framework for the detection, notification, verification, and early response to public health emergencies of international concern. Global Influenza Surveillance Network, or GISN, is an international network for monitoring of influenza activity and circulating influenza virus strains. In addition to these official mechanisms, WHO also monitors the informal or unofficial sources of information to detect the possible infectious disease outbreaks. WHO has adopted the International Health Regulations in 2005 to strengthen the global public health surveillance of infectious disease outbreaks. So according to the IHR 2005, any case of the smallpox, polio, human influenza by new subtype, or SARS detected by national surveillance system should be directly notified to WHO. And also any events of potential international public health concern or other infectious diseases such as cholera, plague, or yellow fever are also reported to WHO if there is a high risk for the international public health concern. The second global surveillance mechanism for influenza pandemic by WHO is the Global Influenza Surveillance Network, or GISN. GISN has been serving as a global alert mechanism for the emergence of influenza virus strains with pandemic potential. GISN consists of 131 national influenza centers in 105 countries, and there are 5 WHO collaborating centers in Japan, Australia, UK, and the United States. Through this international network, GISN collects the clinical specimens and influenza virus isolates from all over the world. Every year, over 175,000 clinical specimens are collected from patients worldwide, and WHO collaborating centers receive these virus isolates and analyze the antigenic and genetic profile of virus strains that are the basis for the influenza vaccines. At the very early stage, we have to detect and investigate the initial cases and also the emergence of new pandemic virus strains. This is very important because this could be the basis for the early containment strategy and also development of specific treatment and preventive measures. And also the announcement of a pandemic by WHO can trigger many national or international actions. After initial investigation, we have to assess the disease severity, case definition, incidence of illness, and also clinical and virological characteristics. If an outbreak is developed into pandemic, national and international systems should monitor the progress of outbreak and also track any changes in virological, clinical, or epidemiological patterns. And finally, we have to assess the effectiveness, safety, and also impact of the treatment and preventive measures. So these are the global mechanisms for the surveillance of pandemic influenza by WHO. And actually, there are some other global mechanisms for the surveillance of emerging infectious diseases. And this is one of the examples. The Global Emerging Infection Surveillance and Response System, or GISE,
which was established by the Department of Defense of the United States. And actually, this system was established to perform the surveillance of emerging infectious diseases that could affect the US military personnel all over the world. And this mission was achieved by the global surveillance projects, training and capacity building efforts, and also research and innovation. And these activities are done in 92 countries in the world as of the year 2009. And main focus areas of surveillance by GUIs include the pneumonia, GI infection, vector-borne infection, antimicrobial resistance in major bacterial pathogens, and also sexually transmitted infection. Let me shift gears to the regional surveillance systems for the emerging infectious diseases. The CDC in the United States has organized the Emerging Infections Program, or EIP network, in 1995. The EIP consists of 4 major programs, including Active Bacterial Core Surveillance, or ABCs, FoodNet, Healthcare-Associated Infections, Community Interface Projects, and the Influenza Surveillance Network in the United States. In Europe, the European CDC has also organized a very comprehensive surveillance system, which is the European Surveillance System, or TESI. TESI consists of 10 different surveillance networks, and the European Influenza Surveillance Network, or EISN, is one of the key surveillance systems in the European region. But in the Asian region, there had been no such official systems for the surveillance or research of the emerging infectious diseases or antimicrobial resistance. So I have founded the Asia Pacific Foundation for Infectious Diseases, or AFID, to initiate and coordinate the multinational collaboration for surveillance and research of the infectious diseases and antimicrobial resistance in Asian countries. AFID has been operating 4 major international programs. The ANSORP, which is the Asian Network for Surveillance of Resistant Pathogens, is an international network for the surveillance of resistance in major bacterial pathogens in Asian countries. AFID has also been organizing the International Symposium on Antimicrobial Agents and Resistance, or ISAR, which is the largest international meeting on infectious diseases in the Asian Pacific region, with more than 2,000 participants from all over the world. AFID is also running the Asian Bacterial Bank, which has collected more than 50,000 bacterial strains from Asian countries. And also AFID is planning to launch a new international campaign program called iCare. That stands for the Initiatives to Control Antimicrobial Resistance in Asian countries. So all scientific activities by this foundation are supported by these members of the steering committee. We have Dr. Walt Wilson from Mayo Clinic in the United States. He's my mentor during my fellowship at the Mayo Clinic. Dr. David Livermore from UK, Dr. Victor Lim from Malaysia, Dr. Robert Mellering from Harvard in the United States, Dr. Geiichi Hiramasu from Juntendo University, Japan, and Dr. Frank Cockerill from Mayo Clinic in the United States. The ANSORP was organized in 1996 as the first investigator-initiated multinational network for the surveillance of resistance in Asian countries. When I had first organized ANSORP in 1996 with Asian investigators, we had only 26 investigators from 14 centers. For the past 15 years, ANSORP system has been continuously expanded, and as of year 2011, ANSORP has more than 200 investigators from 111 centers in 63 cities of 13 countries in Asia and the Middle East. So ANSORP is now one of the world's largest international networks for surveillance of resistance. The ANSORP system is located in Korea, the headquarter country, Japan, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, India, and Saudi Arabia. Through this international network, ANSORP has been performing the multinational surveillance of the resistance in Asian countries, including Strep pneumoniae, Staph aureus, enteric pathogens including Salmonella and Shigella, community-acquired MRSA, enterococci, and gram-negative pathogens. And also we have done the surveillance of major infectious diseases in Asian countries, including pneumococcal infections, community-acquired pneumonia, hospital-acquired pneumonia, and also bloodstream infections.
Although NSOP has not been utilized as the surveillance network for the influenza or other emerging infectious diseases, this very strong network in Asia could be utilized for the Sentinel surveillance network in the future for surveillance of influenza and other emerging infectious diseases. So as I presented, we have global, regional, and national surveillance systems for influenza and other emerging infectious diseases. But unfortunately, these systems are not perfect at all. We have multiple problems. As indicated by this Nature article, the disease surveillance needs a revolution, and even in developed countries, epidemiology has been chronically underfunded, so epidemiologists are still in the 19th century. Sorry about that, Dr. Monto, but this is true. And the SARS experience made one lesson clear: inadequate surveillance and response capacity in a single country can endanger national population and also the public health security of the entire world. And if you look at the H1N1 influenza pandemic in 2009, we can easily find out some problems in the surveillance. First of all, we did not get the detailed and accurate information about the influenza pandemic at the very early stage. And also we have multiple problems in the infrastructures of the surveillance of H1N1 influenza pandemic. Actually, more than half of the WHO member states did not have the adequate surveillance system of the seasonal influenza before the H1N1 influenza pandemic. And only less than 20 countries have developed the plans for the ongoing monitoring of pandemic throughout the period. Especially African countries and Asian countries, developing countries, have very serious problems in the surveillance infrastructures. So these countries in Asia and Africa must be the special focus areas for the future development of infrastructures and strategic planning. So future surveillance system, the ideal and effective surveillance system in the future should be useful, sensitive, timely, stable, and representative. It should provide the relevant and qualified data on the outbreaks of infectious diseases. So my summary is, the pandemics of emerging infectious diseases, especially influenza, are constant challenges to the public health and human survival all over the world. And future strategies to control and prevent the pandemics should be based on effective surveillance of emergence. Although we have multiple global, regional, and national surveillance systems, we need to improve and strengthen these surveillance systems in the future. Especially given weak public health infrastructures and high incidence of various infectious diseases, Asia and Africa are very special focus areas for future development of infrastructures and the strategic planning. So it's quite obvious that we will have the future, another pandemics in the near future. So we have to prepare for the worst case scenario, and international collaboration is very critical for effective control and prevention for the future pandemics. Thank you very much for your attention.